And get started. Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Green. I'm the Senior Manager of Parking and Transportation at Georgia College in wonderful Milledgeville, Georgia. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Bringing NACAS Workshop Presentations to New Heights. I would like to inform all attendees that this webinar is being recorded. Thank you to the NACAS Educational Foundation for their sponsorship, making this and all webinars available at no cost to NACAS and CCBO members. Before I introduce our presenter, I want to give a few tips regarding today's webinar. If you have any technical difficulties, please press *0 and a representative will be happy to assist you. Currently, everyone is muted. To unmute your phone, please use *6. And finally, we have set aside 15 minutes at the end of the session to answer questions. We do encourage you to type your questions in the Chat Everyone window in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. The presenter will answer the questions at the end of the webinar. Now, I would like to introduce today's speaker. Brian Washburn, CEO and lead coach of Endurance Learning LLC, is a training professional who is on a mission to help every presenter change the world by helping them deliver amazing presentations. Brian has been facilitating workshops and engaging in instructional design and training development for over 17 years. And in 2011, Training Magazine named him a top young trainer. Brian has developed a unique presentation coaching system and is the co-founder of Endurance Learning LLC. Thanks to Brian for taking the time to share his knowledge and experience with us today. Now, I'd like to turn things over to Brian to begin the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan, and welcome to everyone who's joining us. Thank you for giving us some time this afternoon, and why don't we go ahead and jump right in. As Ryan mentioned, my name is Brian Washburn, and there's a picture of me. I've been working in this world of creating presentations for about 17 years, and as Ryan also mentioned, I'm now currently serving as the lead coach for an organization called Endurance Learning. And so basically that means that we'll help people put together presentations, and if they need some help or a fresh set of eyes or some thoughts in terms of how to do things better, that's where I come in, just in terms of giving some help in terms of what makes for a good presentation. And as Ryan also mentioned, my goal on this planet is really to change the world. And it's not just kind of a fun motto to think about. It's actually something that I truly believe that when people give an effective presentation, they really do have an opportunity to change everybody who is in the audience on any given day. And so if I'm able to help people put together better presentations, then they will be able to change not just the world, but the people's worlds who are in that presentation. And I think that there's a certain multiplier effect that goes with that. That having been said, over the next 41 minutes or so in terms of presentation delivery, and certainly if you have questions, go ahead and type them in that chat box and we'll get to those as they come up. But over the course of the next 41 minutes or so, there's actually going to be a couple of things that happen, and we call that a parallel process. And so I'll certainly be delivering some content on this topic of presentation skills, but I'll also try to do some modeling in terms of strategies that you may want to incorporate into your own presentations. And I'll try to point those out where those come. And so by the end of this hour, there are certain things that I want to be able to accomplish here, and I want you all to be able to do by the end of the time that you've invested here on this webinar. And the first thing is really write effective learning objectives. And basically that's going to be the beginning point for any presentation. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a little bit. Also, when it comes to creating a presentation, I'd love to make sure that you're able to align session activities to those objectives, and we'll get to that also throughout the course of this presentation. I'd love for you to be able to engage your audience for maximum attention, and finally assess whether your mission was accomplished. And so there's a number of different steps that go into an effective presentation that will keep people engaged. Before I go any further, what I'm going to do is I really want to not just use that chat box for questions, but also for some different opportunities to participate. I know that everyone, when they called in, they've been put on mute. And so perhaps the best way to facilitate conversation or get some interaction going is by using that chat box. And here's a place where I'm going to start just with a question for the group. And that really is, when you take a look at these objectives for today's session, what do you notice about those? And if you could write down a few of your observations in that chat box, I'd love just to hear your initial thoughts in terms of these objectives for this hour. Is there anything that you notice? I see that there's some typing going on, and as that typing happens, I'll go ahead and give you a few hints here.
Right.
And it looks like Margaret mentioned that they're all action words. And Erin mentioned that their objectives are on the basis of the whole thing. Absolutely. And so when you take a look at these objectives, and if other people have thoughts, go ahead and type those in as well. I'm going to continue to talk here. But when you take a look at the first part of all of these objectives, they are all action words, and they're also observable. They're not just action words, but they're observable words. They're observable actions that I'll actually be able to see if you're able to do if I've designed this session correctly. Somebody else mentioned that engaging is critical, and that really is a key piece. I can't just talk at you for 45 minutes and expect you to stay engaged while you have other things to do. The email is going to be really tempting over these next 45 minutes, and I'm going to try to do my best to make sure that you're paying attention to this, and not necessarily your email, at least for this time chunk here. And also, objectives are the basis of the whole thing. Not only are they the basis for the whole thing, but they're also written in terms of things that I want you to be able to do. Not necessarily in terms of what I want to have happen here, but these are really framed in terms of what the 45 participants on this for this webinar really should be able to do. I'll talk a little bit more about the crafting of objectives. As you can see, the first objective right up there is so that you all can be able to write effective learning objectives. I'll talk a little bit more about those as we get going here. One of the things that I'm going to do before I go too much further, though, is to ask you all a question. This particular session is about bringing presentations to new heights. And so again, going back to this chat box, I just want to get a feel for who all is with us. And so if you could just type in how long you've been presenting, just to give me a feel for, do we have people who are relatively new to presentations? Do we have people who are certainly experienced and have been doing presentations for a long, long time? All right, so I'm starting to see some things here. All right, so we have a pretty big range from anywhere from 1 year to 44 years. All right, so, and they're continuing to come. So this is really helpful to give me a feel for kind of your experience. Now, having experience is one thing, and what I'm going to do now is another way just to kind of engage people in addition to typing things in. People have been presenting for a long time, but somebody said that their presentations are boring. All right, so let's figure out if we can find some ways to fix that. So one of the things that can be helpful is to get an understanding for what's your frame of mind when you're asked to do a presentation. So I'm going to put in that lower right-hand corner a poll question. I'm going to ask you just to vote here. When you have a presentation, when you've been told that you have to do a presentation, what's the first thing go through your mind? Is it, great, I get to dazzle people with my wisdom? Is it fun? Now it's time to figure out how to get people excited about my topic? Is it, uh-oh, I need to get in front of people and talk? This makes me nervous. Or is it, no, why me? What's going through your mind when you first have an opportunity to do a presentation? And as the results come in, you can see that they're coming in here. So it looks like the biggest answer, and this is, and I don't mean to influence you if you have not yet voted, but it seems like the biggest answer that's coming in right now is fun. Now it's time to figure out how to get people excited about my topic. And that's where I am right now. Honestly, I've gone through the range of emotions. When I first started presenting, I thought, great, I get to dazzle people with my wisdom. And then I realized that, well, presentations aren't necessarily always about me and my wisdom. It's how do I get people excited about my topic. But certainly when I first started, it was either no, why me, or uh-oh, it makes me nervous. And so the frame of mind through which people approach a presentation is the first thing that can really be an indicator of whether or not it's going to be any good or not. And then we have to do some other things as well. So I know people who've presented for less than a year and they're amazingly confident. And I know people who've been presenting for 15 years and still get incredibly nervous. I know people who've been presenting for 20 years and are the most boring speakers you've ever seen. And I know people who've lit up the room the first time they've gotten in front of an audience. And in my observation, do you know what the difference was? Is a question that it's maybe a rhetorical question. Not necessarily the number of years of presentation experience. It really does come down to preparation. A well-prepared presenter generally has less anxiety. And
Flip.
I think we're having some technical difficulties. Just give us 1 minute and hopefully we can get them back on the call.
are you able to hear me now, Ryan?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Whew. Okay, so I'm back. One of the things that I'd love to hear a little bit more, again, about this audience, not just about in terms of your number of years of presentation experience, but if you think about a presentation that's coming up, what topic might you be presenting on in the relatively near future? So if you could, again, go back to that chat box and give me a feel for what kind of presentations you might be presenting in the relatively near future. It looks like some people are typing in some answers here. All right, so things such as transportation programs, student management development, overview of university budget, marketing strategies. All right, so we have a range of different topics. And I'm going to lay out kind of a formula. And this will be a formula that could probably be used for all of this whole range of topics. And before I get into this formula, actually the starting of this formula, is that I really have found that there's something that every presenter who's preparing can do, and it's a little bit of a magical step here. And so the single most important element in creating an effective presentation, and that, are you ready for this secret? It's basically like rubbing the lamp of a cheek. So the single most important element in creating an effective presentation is, well, if we rub this lamp, we'll get some smoke and we'll see what comes out. And it really is well-defined learning objectives. It's something that I started this session by kind of laying out and talking about. I had you analyze a little bit my objectives. And it's really not the PowerPoint slides. The PowerPoint slides are not the single most important element in creating an effective presentation. And it's not about your ability to inject humor into a presentation or begin with a joke. That could be helpful in the right situation, but that's not the most important element. It really does come down to the idea of learning objectives, and I'll talk a little bit why these are so magical as we get going here. And part of it is because everybody has a goal for their presentation, right? I want to talk to people about transportation programs, or I have experience to share when it comes to physical plant and the particular help desk that we need for the 21st century. So those might be my goals. Now, a goal is something that you do, certainly in soccer, and it's something that individuals are able to do. The goal is about you. The question here is, why would you ever want to get up in front of an audience and present to them at a conference in the first place? And that comes down to the objectives. The objectives are about the crowd that's cheering. So it's one thing to meet your goal or to score your goal. It's another thing to be able to answer why someone would attend your presentation. They want to see you hit that goal, but they also want to come away with something when it comes to that presentation. And that So even if you have the best idea in the world, even if you have the best retail dining marketing in the world, but you're not able to express that in a way that your participants will be able to absorb, it's an idea that's not communicated. So let's take a look at some of these objectives and let's talk a little bit more about why this is such an important element in the preparation and why they're so magical. And here's the list that I shared at the very beginning. And there are some certain components to an effective learning objective, and this is what I want you to be able to do by the time you're done here. I explained to you at the very beginning of this presentation that there are some certain elements. You take a look at the very beginning. It's the verbs that get used. It's the fact that these are learner-centered. It's the fact that so when you take a look at, I've talked here for about 15 minutes now, and mostly I've talked about this idea of objectives. And in order to write effective learning objectives, you need to make sure that you have the right components. So if you could use the chat box right now, and if you're able to tell me, based on what you've heard over the past 15 minutes, what are some of the essential components to an effective learning objective? I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the essential components to a learning objective? And I want to see if this message is getting through a little bit. Go ahead and use that chat box and chat everyone. Tell me what you think are some, okay, so writing them effectively. Measurable is absolutely important. Make sure they're specific, they're realistic, they're time-based. Having some repetition that goes in there. To make sure they're able to engage with these. One of the other things that I mentioned early on, and I see that people are still writing, and I'm taking a look, is that every one of these objectives is going to be something that I can observe you doing. And so I'm going to be able to, if I were to ask you to write a learning objective right now, I'd actually be able to see that. I'm actually, in just a minute, I'm going to ask you to tell me how we might be able to align learning objectives with actual lessons. I love what TJ just wrote, is that these need to be connected with your audience. These are all written from an audience's perspective. So when you're designing, when you're first sitting down, you're thinking, what should my presentation look like? It really should be written from the audience's perspective. And then the only other things that I would also add to these learning objectives is that they would never ever begin with the words know or understand. So by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to know what an effective learning objective is. I would never be able to observe that as a presenter. By the end of this presentation, you'll be able to understand how session activities can align to objectives. I would never be able to observe that as a presenter. When I write learning objectives in this format, suddenly I need to make sure that there is time left in my session where I can actually observe whether or not we'll be able to align session activities to those objectives. So it's one thing to be able to write an effective learning objective. It's another thing, and as you can see, I also want you to be able to align these activities in a session to those objectives. So let's see what this would look like in practice. I'm going to give you a sample learning objective here, and then I'm going to put up a poll question. It's time to test the magic of this learning objective. And so the first learning objective as an example that we might want to take a look at is right here. For example, if you had to do a presentation, by the end of this presentation, my audience will be able to describe how one university dining hall increased revenue by 20% through a mobile payment system. If this was something that you wanted to accomplish in your presentation, what activity do you think would be the best fit for this objective as you were creating a presentation? Do you think that you would use lecture to get your audience to describe this strategy? Would you use a case study? Or would you perhaps have people turn to someone and discuss? And I see that some people are starting to vote. I'm going to wait for another few seconds to see what you would think. How would you create this learning objective, and then how would you align this when you're actually delivering your presentation? Because it's one thing to write learning objectives and say, okay, this is audience-centric, and it's observable, and then it's another thing to actually get into your presentation and complete this objective. So let's go ahead and, so nobody has chosen lecture. And this is one of the things that's really important here. Earlier, somebody said, I've been presenting for a long time, but my presentations are boring. And one way to mitigate that idea of creating boring presentations is to make sure that your audience has an opportunity to do something in your actual session. Whether that is a session that has 5 people in attendance, or 50 people, or 500 in a general ballroom, we want to make sure that the audience is engaged somehow. And so the magic of learning objectives is that it creates an activity for you to shoot for. So in this particular session, I would personally say, and 3 other people have said, that they would turn to someone and discuss. Now, if you created a learning objective that looked a little bit differently, maybe that's when a lecture would be the most appropriate. So if I created a learning objective that said, by the end of this presentation, my audience will be able to listen to, well, that's when lectures, when lecture is going to be the be-all and end-all of an activity that you might throw into a lesson. Now, if I was to say, I want people to be able to examine, well, that might be when you throw a case study in there, and maybe there'd even be some discussion about that case study, or it really depends on the session and the format, but at least people would be able to see a real-life example and examine how one university dining hall did this. But in this particular example, it was, I want people to be able to describe how one university dining hall increased revenue by 20%. And so maybe I'd lecture a little bit, or maybe I'd throw a case study out there, but I'd want the audience to be able to do something, and in this example, maybe I'd have them turn to someone and discuss. And again, whether or not the session has 5 people or 500, this could be a learning strategy. If you're in a big ballroom, it's very possible that you would say, hey, turn to the person next to you. Based on this information that I just shared, how might you apply this in your own university settings back home? And that is one way to make this objective come to life. Now, some people may be a little bit anxious with this idea, and people may be asking, well, will people actually turn to the person next to them? Brian, what are you setting me up for? And I'll give you an example. Again, going back to this idea that I help coach people put together presentations as well. And I was working with one doctor who was putting together a presentation on telemedicine. And if you've ever been to a medical symposium, doctors are used to sitting and receiving passively the information that's presented. And so when I suggested to this doctor, well, what if you just kind of had people turn to the person next to them and discuss? He actually put that into his presentation. And this was a quote that he sent me after he delivered the presentation. He said, I did what you suggested for my second objective, which was to discuss something, and had people imagine 3 potential pitfalls. And I had them write them down and then share them with a neighbor. And since this was just the 3rd talk of the conference on the very first day, many people hadn't met other people. Everyone in the room participated, and I had to cut them off after 7 minutes of talking amongst themselves to bring them back. Great ideas from the audience, and it really enriched the discussion. So there's a couple of things that happened when he was able to add this just little piece of interaction into a large ballroom full of doctors. 1, it broke the ice. 2, it gave them an opportunity to personalize the information so that they could actually figure out, okay, this doctor's talking about what he did at his hospital. These are some pitfalls that we could face at my hospital, and this is how we can get beyond it. Because as a speaker, there's no way that we'll ever be able to predict what all of the challenges that our audience will face. Our audience knows that better than we will. And so by giving them an opportunity to play around with our content, during the actual session. It's an opportunity for them to actually start to create content that's going to be meaningful for them, to supplement our message with a message that's going to be personal for them. So will people actually turn to the person next to them? Maybe they won't, but in general, when people are invited to participate, even in this webinar, when people have been invited to participate by typing things in or by doing poll questions, it's pretty non-threatening, and it's an opportunity, again, just to kind of engage with the content. Let's take a look at another example of a learning objective that actually can create magic of engagement. So again, and we'll put up another poll question here because I'm going to ask you again, what kind of activity would you choose if this was an actual objective of yours? By the end of this presentation, my audience will be able to list 3 key elements to create a vendor scorecard in order to monitor supplier relationships. So if this was your objective, would you lecture? Would you have your audience maybe vote? Or would you have them turn to someone and discuss? Go ahead and take a look at that poll in that bottom right-hand corner. It looks like we're starting to get some thoughts here. And again, I'm going to just underline, so they're going to be able to list. So, and you still have a chance to vote. You have a chance to change your vote. You have a chance to vote by not voting, I guess. So by the end of this presentation, my audience will be able to list 3 key elements. All right, let's go ahead and take a look. So we have some people saying that they would lecture for this. We have some people saying that they would vote, and some people saying they'd turn to someone to discuss. All right, so again, if I wanted to, if I wanted to have people list, it would be very difficult to see whether or not they're able to do that just by lecturing. Lecturing is generally one-way communication. And so maybe if your objective was, I just want them to be able to hear about some key elements, well, that might be lecture, and that might be the best strategy. If I wanted people to be able to prioritize, then maybe I would have them vote. Hey, these are all the different elements to create a vendor scorecard, or to create whatever resource when it comes to the presentation that you plan to do. So these are all of the elements that could go into it. If you could only keep one element, what would it be? And why don't we vote on that? And voting can happen in a number of different ways. We'll talk about that in just a second. But again, this particular objective, we want people to list. So maybe you would actually say, okay, so these are all of the different elements. Why don't you turn to the person next to you? Just like that previous example of the doctor, he actually had people write down things and then turn to the person next to them and discuss. A lot of times at these large conferences or even in breakout sessions, there's going to be a little pad of paper. Take advantage of that. Have people write down their thoughts and then turn to the person next to them. So, but this idea of voting, and voting can happen in a number of different ways. It can happen, again, in either a large ballroom or a small breakout session just by a low-tech show of hands. There's also other technologies that, that may be helpful for you to kind of play around and experiment, depending on how much risk you want to take on as you're preparing your next presentation. There's one service out there called Poll Everywhere. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put the link to it in the chat box. And it's called polleverywhere.com. Now, I don't have any relationship with Poll Everywhere other than I use the service. But they're not paying me to advertise or anything. But this is a really interesting way for people to be able to engage with their audience, large or small. And the audience, again, it's pretty non-threatening. The audience can simply use the phones in their pockets, which they might be using anyway to email or to check Facebook or whatever. So if they're going to have them out anyway, hey, why not have them engage with the presentation a little bit? And so what you can do is you can go into this website, you can set up a poll, you can embed it in your PowerPoint slides, and then you can actually have them text an answer. So you can check at a glance how your audience of 20 or 200 or 2,000, depending on how big your audiences are, what they think about a specific fact or list that you might be presenting. So it's, again, it's kind of a way to integrate some technology and integrate engagement into your presentation. So that's kind of a high-tech way to do it. Depending on how big your audience is, it can be a free service, or you may have, if it's a really big audience and you get some more features and things like that. Or you can just have them give you a show of hands. So you can go high-tech or low-tech there. But again, that's one way to really start to engage people. Now, the key to an effective presentation is really that first word that begins your learning objectives. And one way to really get into that, because a lot of times we get into this rut, okay, well, if I have to create learning objectives, a lot of times they look very similar. I want people to list this, and I want people to list this and describe this. But one, I want people to describe, I want people to verify, I want people to debate, I want people to compare, I want people to brainstorm or solve. These are all magic words that can help, they virtually create your presentation for you. If I want people to be able to simulate something, or if I want them to be able to decide something, well, I need to create some space during the presentation in order to allow them to do this. Decide is a great verb. It can be something where people can turn to the person next to them, or it can simply be something where the people write something down on the scratch pad that's in front of them. Or maybe if it's a webinar, I can have people write it into the chat box. It's a very non-threatening way for people to be asked to do something, and then to have them engage with your content, as opposed to, again, the lecture where it's didactic, it's one way, it's just having people listen and receive the information, predict, generate. And so after this presentation, what we'll make available for you all is just this list that, as you think through what is it that I want people really to be able to accomplish by the end of my presentation, this is a great list that just gives you a bunch of objective starters. So that will be available to you. So, all right, I've talked a lot about learning objectives. And I keep saying that good learning objectives virtually write your presentations for you, but they don't actually write your presentation for you. You still need to give your presentation some structure. And so I'm going to put another quick poll up here, and it's just going to be a quick yes or no question. And my question to you is this. After developing effective learning objectives, is it time to open up PowerPoint? Because we all know we have to do a presentation, right? What's the first thing we do? We open up PowerPoint. So I've just shared with you, well, actually the first thing might be to create learner-centered, action-oriented, smart learning objectives. And once those are created, what do you think? Is it time to open up PowerPoint? So we have some people saying no, a few people saying yes, let's get to it. Some people who haven't voted yet, so go ahead and cast those votes. So I have listed, it's learner-centered. By the end of this presentation, you'll be able to explain this, and you'll be able to discuss this and list this. All right, so we have a little bit of a mixed bag. The majority of people are saying, nope, not yet. And some people are saying yes. So for those people who say no, if you could type in your thoughts of what do you think comes next? What comes between learning objectives and let's create the PowerPoint presentation? What would you do next? I'm going to ask that question and see what people have to say. So we have some people typing in some things right now. Write an outline. Create an outline and a flow. Okay, develop an outline. I like these responses. Now, one can argue, hey, in PowerPoint there is an outline feature. And one of the things that I would also say in answer to this poll question, I'm waiting for a couple more answers just to see what people have to say. Housekeeping. All right, as people type in their answers, I would also, to answer this question, I would also say no, not quite yet. So we have learning objectives, and now what we need to do is figure out how really we're going to organize this. So determine the message and how you want to deliver it exactly. test if the objective is right is actually not a bad idea. One of the things about learning objectives is you don't want to get too ambitious. If you only have 20 minutes to do a presentation, the verbs that you choose will be very important. You may be able to have people list or prioritize things through voting. You probably won't have people create something from scratch in a 20-minute session. So the verbs that you use are pretty important. And then the question becomes, how do you organize your thoughts? And a lot of people were saying outline what you see in front of you, and it's a small image, but this is what I've used over the years in order to organize my thoughts. We kind of start with some of the basics, get those learning objectives down early, and then we go into the session. Start with just kind of the basics. What even is the title of this presentation? What's the overall goal? Remember that soccer player who's scoring the goal. What is it that I want to do? I want to share with people what presentation skills can be and how to organize their thoughts. How long is the presentation going to be? I have about 45 minutes to deliver it, and then some Q&A. And then I go through my learning objectives. And after that, what I'll do is I will start to kind of map out, and what people said is create an outline, but really the flow of the presentation. Not just what do I want to say, but how am I going to deliver it? So the instructional technique. Am I going to lecture? Am I going to lecture for a little bit, and then am I going to ask a question? Are we going to have some discussion? Am I going to ask people to type something in the chat box? What's the technique I'm going to use? And then finally, how long actually am I going to take in any particular section? Because I don't want to spend too much time just talking about the finer points of learning objectives. I need to get into how are people going to align certain activities with those objectives as well. And so, so definitely the content and key points are one area, kind of the sequence and flow, but also how am I going to do it and how much time am I going to really allocate. Sometimes an area where I've found people tripping up is that they have welcome and introduction and they'll build in an icebreaker. And if they only have 20 or 30 minutes to present and they realize, oh my gosh, I'm taking 20 minutes of just this icebreaker because what I want to do is I want to go around the room and I want everybody to introduce themselves. This particular outline is a really good check to figure out, am I misallocating time? Am I spending too much time in one area that's not quite as essential, and is that going to cost me later on in the presentation? So this particular image right here gives you an idea of just an example of how I start to fill this out. And the reason I wanted to show this to you is for a couple of reasons. One is because when I do this, sometimes I'll realize if I put together a presentation well enough, sometimes I realize, you know what, I don't even need PowerPoint for this particular session. So maybe I'll plan to use handouts or just walk through a case study or perhaps use flip chart as a better means of delivering it. So maybe PowerPoint isn't even necessary. But sometimes when I do need PowerPoint, all I need to do is put some keywords up there. I don't need to write down every single point of my presentation on the slide. Sometimes when people open up PowerPoint first, they'll write down every single piece of information that they want to deliver, and they'll actually put that in the slide. And one of the problems with that is that your brain actually can't process reading all of the information on the slide and listening to the person at the same time. And so one of the things that this outline actually helps to do is to reduce the amount of reminders that you need on the screen, and it gives you just kind of an outline that you can keep in your hands, while the visual that other people are seeing can be pretty basic and highlight just key points. And the third reason why I think that this outline is pretty important and why I wanted to show you kind of an example of what this might look like is, as you can see, it's not necessarily a verbatim script, but it does have key talking points. And if I'm stuck in traffic or if I'm sick, I could actually give this outline to somebody else who may be familiar with the topic, and they would be able to do this topic justice. And that's not always the case if all you have is a slide deck and say, oh, you know, I'm running late. Hey, can you cover for me? The slide deck is here, because that's pretty difficult to try to decipher what somebody wanted to do just based on slides. But if you have some talking points here, it can also be helpful. Or maybe you did this presentation once and then you don't do it again for another year. It will remind you what your presentation, what your talking points were. A final note, just real quick about visual aids in PowerPoint, since I've talked about it a little bit. Graphic design is a whole other topic, but the visual experience that you create for your audience can really make a big impact. And so I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to ask again in the chat box if there's anything that you've noticed about the visual aids that you particularly like about the slides that are here that maybe you want to kind of borrow, again, going back to that parallel process. Is there anything about the visual experience of this particular webinar that you may appreciate or perhaps like? Maybe it's an idea that you want to steal and steal away because really one of the things about presentations and the learning environment is that there are very few new ideas when it comes to ways things are delivered, a lot of recycled ways. And so if you want to be able to recycle some of these ideas, please do. So I'd love to hear your thoughts right now, just in terms of the visual experience of this webinar. What are some of the things that you've noticed about these slides? So the branding is simple, and this is the template that NACAS uses. And so working within that template, there's certainly the branding, and we're able to create something that is integrated into that branding as well. Some other things that I'm seeing here. There are polls, yes, and so we're able to really engage people. We'll even put up the question here. We're using the technology, so the polls that are built into this particular webinar technology, where we can actually be able to get some interaction and see what people have to say. Somebody else said they like the polls a lot, and again, if this is something that you like, this parallel process is something that I don't want to just kind of talk about presentation skills without giving you some examples of what might help to engage your audience going forward. So just even asking the audience, and it could even be a rhetorical question, but asking the audience to think about a question that you give them before you launch into your content can help pique their curiosity and figure out, okay, they asked me this question, I wonder how they're going to answer it throughout the course of this presentation. It's not, the slides are also not too busy, they're to the point. So here we have a lot of text, but it's actually just kind of an image capture. A lot of the slides have been pretty big font. And it's not just the default font that you would find when you open up PowerPoint. We've played around with the font to try to give a little bit of a feel for the learning. When we had the quote from the doctor earlier, we were able to kind of give a little bit different font just to illustrate that those were words from somebody else. So you can definitely create a mood with the visual images that you have as well. All right, so we have come to kind of the end of the design portion, kind of organizing your thoughts. After you've been able to define your learning objectives and then create an outline, and this is the template that I use, then if you feel that PowerPoint is going to be an essential tool, then it might be the time to open up that PowerPoint presentation. So I'm going to pause here, and as Ryan mentioned at the very beginning, that we do have some time carved out here for Q&A. And so if you have some questions, you can feel free to go ahead and type those questions in the chat box. I'd love to hear your thoughts or what questions you have at this point. My basic final thought here, and if you don't have questions for me, I actually have some questions for you, so we'll get to it. But one of the final things that I want to leave you with before we get into the Q&A is that when it comes to bringing presentations to new heights, making sure you have absolute clarity about what you want your audience to be able to do by the end of your presentation, and then making sure that you've mapped out, how can I see if they're able to do that, are essential elements to engage in your audience and for you to hold yourself accountable to figure out, hey, are they able to do this or not? So I have some questions here. Can we get your design template? So if you're talking about the PowerPoint design template, I've used the NACAS PowerPoint slides. Now, if you are talking about using the lesson plan format, yes, we can definitely pass that along, and I will send that along to Ryan and to Kelly to distribute to the group. both the list of verbs as well as that the lesson plan outline as well. Do you have any programs you suggest in place of PowerPoint? And so somebody else said Prezi. Is that a particular thing? Or if you have a Mac, we use Keynote. And so I think there are some alternatives to PowerPoint. One of the things that I like to do, sometimes for fun, sometimes I do it to challenge myself, sometimes I just do it to make a point, is I don't use PowerPoint. And part of that depends on your room setup and the size of your audience. One of the things that I like to do, especially in a breakout room where there's 30 or maybe 30 or 40 people, is that flip chart actually works a little bit better. And one of the things that I like about flip chart is that with PowerPoint, when you advance the next slide, your previous slide is gone. People can't see it. With flip chart, one of the things that you can do with that when you put it around the room is that can stay up for the entire session. So we might be talking about learning objectives for the first 5 minutes or so. And if I have a flip chart that actually gives the structure to a good learning objective, and then 10, 15, 20 minutes later, I'm on to something else, and somebody in the audience still wants to think, how do we create the objectives again? They can refer to that flip chart, or even handouts can actually do that as well. So that's one example of a visual aid. There are several other examples of visual aids. Again, it really depends on the size of your audience. Flip chart doesn't work as well when you're in a large ballroom. I've actually been in presentations where people try to use flip chart, and I've been maybe in the second or third row of a large ballroom, and still to see the flip chart and somebody writing on the stage, it can be a little bit trickier. There are actually ways that you can type into a PowerPoint slide in the moment. And so there is a way to write on PowerPoint slides, even if it's in presentation mode. And then another thing, going back to that poll everywhere, that can also be a really good way if you want to get some interaction with your audience and have them create content. You can ask both poll questions, so asking them to vote, choices A, B, C, or D. You can actually also ask people to type in short answers to questions that you might have and see what your audience thinks about that. And then the words kind of pop up as long as you have an internet connection in the room. And so those are a couple of different alternatives to just using PowerPoint as a visual aid. There are also some other services out there, like Haiku Deck, for example, is kind of a PowerPoint alternative where you can start to create your slides, and it also has images that you can insert right from that particular software, and then you can export that to PowerPoint. So there are a number of different ways to get a visual experience. And then finally, somebody else mentioned Prezi. Prezi is, and if you're not familiar with it, it's another kind of presentation tool that's a little bit different than PowerPoint. The transitions will be a little bit different. It's really important that you keep to just simple key concepts, and you can almost create a story flow with your visual aids that way. If you haven't used it, and if you're kind of curious, definitely check out Prezi. The one caution about Prezi, and one of the complaints that I've heard from peers and colleagues, is that Prezi can also be a little bit, if you're familiar with the movie Blair Witch Project, it can make you kind of dizzy if you get a little too crazy with the transition. So that's one note of caution, although that can also happen with PowerPoint if you get too crazy with some of your transitions. And again, somebody said, can we get your design template, talking about the lesson plan, and yes, we'll definitely distribute that. Any other questions that people may have at this point about presentation design, bringing presentations to new heights? And if you do have other questions, go ahead and type them in. I have questions for you at this point. So if you were to take a look at this, this is a learning objective. My question for you, and we'll go ahead and actually do this in a poll format. My question for you is, when you take a look at this, do you think that this is an effective learning objective? I want to see, now this is, again, going back to the parallel process. One of my objectives is that you'd be able to write effective learning objectives, and I don't necessarily have an opportunity right here to actually have you write on the screen effective learning objectives, but perhaps you could identify what makes for an effective learning objective or not. So by the end of this presentation, my audience will be able to know why leveraging technology is important to scaling an initiative. And I'm seeing a lot of people write no. And that warms my heart because the answer is no. Now my question here, and somebody actually already said the reason for this. Aaron Nielsen has said you just say no to the word no, and I think that is a good refrain. Again, as a presenter, I can't see whether or not somebody knows something. I can see if they can explain why leveraging technology is important to scaling initiative, but no is something very difficult for me to observe. All right, why don't we do this one? In this one, we're actually going to ask you to type in your thoughts in the chat box. If your goal for a presentation is to teach your audience about a new recycling initiative that has decreased waste on your campus, what is one learning objective you might write when planning this presentation? So let's see how bold people can get in the remaining minutes here. Do you think that you can actually craft an effective learning objective in the chat box? So if your goal is to teach an audience about a new recycling initiative that's decreased waste on your campus, what would be a learning objective? So the goal is you-centered. A learning objective is audience-centered. What might be one learning objective? And it looks like Aaron is taking me up on this challenge. Discuss 3 ways to decrease waste on your campus. I would say that discuss 3 ways, and Aaron or anybody else, if that was your objective, what might be a way that you would actually align some type of activity in your presentation with that particular objective? Various people are typing right now. I love this audience. People seem pretty engaged and are willing to engage here. Ways for individual participation, exactly. What kind of individual participation could you see happening in a session like this? Share with your table. Yes, so again, room setup, and this actually touches on another point. Room setup is another important piece. Again, if it's more of a breakout room or a smaller kind of conference room as opposed to large ballroom, or even I've seen large ballrooms in keynote speakers that have been set up with tables, but you don't necessarily always need to have classroom style seating. You don't need rows and rows and rows of seats. If you do, and if you can't change it around, then you can certainly have people kind of turn to the person next to them. If they're at tables, and if you're able to set the room at tables or in small kind of clusters of seating, then this is a great way for you to have people share at their table how you saved, or maybe what some of the challenges are at your own campus when it comes to decreasing waste. And that can be a discussion point. So this is one way to engage people. It's also a way for presenters to figure out what are some of the things that are on my participants' minds. Again, when it's just one-way communication, when you've designed something where you're just going to present out, it's really tough to find out what's on your participants' minds. We have some other things. Describe one sustainability measure university employees and students can complete to support recycling efforts on campus. And I could see this being, this could be anywhere in the presentation. It could be what you use to start a presentation, and then people could report out maybe some of the things that they're doing, and then you could go through a case study, or you could go through a case study and then say, okay, we just went through that. At your tables, describe one of the measures, and would that be feasible at your own campus? Have participants touch base every 3 months with the amount of recycled in the department. Kathleen just mentioned something here that can also lead not just to an engaging presentation, but actually a presentation that leads to results. And part of that is accountability. As a presenter, especially if I'm going to go to a conference, it's really tough for me to keep in touch with the participants. I oftentimes don't even know who attended the presentation. But if you give your participants an opportunity to make connections, and then if one of your calls to action at the end of your presentation is to say, okay, get at least one person's email address. That is your buddy. You're buddied up. Now, 3 months from now, or maybe a month from now, check in with that person to see where they are in terms of what they wanted to do as a result of this presentation. It's one way to make your presentation go further from something that could be engaging and entertaining to something that actually leads to results. And you can go to your organization and say, look, I went to this workshop and it actually led to a change in behavior. And that's almost the holy grail of presentations. We're coming to the end of our time here together. And if there are no more questions, I love the participation. I really appreciate this group for engaging so much here. What I want to do is just share a little bit of my own information. If you are curious to know a little bit more about what Endurance Learning does, we have our website right there. I'd also love to connect with you. I'm pretty active on Twitter, and my handle there is FlipChartGuy, for probably obvious reasons at this point. You can also, if you have questions or as you're thinking about this presentation a little bit more, or if you have a presentation that's coming up and just want a fresh set of eyes, feel free to drop me an email. I'm happy to engage and we can talk a little bit and bounce some ideas around. And the final thing is if you're ever just looking for just some nuggets or some ideas about what presentations can be, or ideas around e-learning, or perhaps ideas about how to measure learning and development and presentations that you're doing. That last link there, trainlikeachampion.wordpress.com, is a blog that I publish twice a week. So it really is something that I'm really focused on being able to change the way people go about doing their presentations. And through that, my goal is that the world will be a better place. When people can create more effective presentations, they really can touch the hearts and minds of the people in their audience, and through that change the world. So thank you very much for your time. I'm going to turn back to Ryan if there are any closing words.
Well, thank you, Brian, for giving us that great information this afternoon and engaging us. I think we got a lot from the webinar and the presentation, so thanks for taking your time to do that. I'd also like to thank the NACAS Educational Foundation for their sponsorship and making this professional development opportunity complimentary to NACAS and CCBO members. We appreciate everybody for joining us on this webinar today. NACAS strives to provide the best in educational opportunities for our members based on their professional needs. We hope this webinar provides the resources you need to continue enhancing your own auxiliary services. You will also be able to access this webinar online at a later date. Thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon, and please have a good rest of your day and week.